Now, in tonight's debate, I'm going to defend two basic contentions. First, that there's no good argument that atheism is true.
Are there good reasons?
And secondly, there are good arguments that atheism is true.
Are there? Do you think?
Now, most carefully, the circumscribed limits of those contentions. We're not here tonight to debate the social impact of religion or Testament ethics.
Hey gang, and welcome. I just wanted to give you a quick heads up about what's going on with this video. This is the presentation of the Kalam Cosmological argument by William Lane Craig. We're going to talk about it, we're going to digest it, break it all apart, and examine it. I had a special guest on with me. Our conversation for this was about an hour and a half. That's longer than I like my videos to be. I want them to be a little more digestible, so I'm going to break this into 3 parts. So it's going to be like a little mini-series inside the big William Lane Craig series. Each video should be about 25 to 35 minutes. There might be a short bonus episode on the end. I don't know yet. We'll figure that part out. So, as always, if you like the video, thumbs up. If you don't like it, thumbs down. That's fine. I won't judge. I love you all. Remember to subscribe. Please leave comments, whatever, down below. What did we get right? What do you think we got wrong? Did we misrepresent anybody or any positions? Let us know. We want to hear that. And now on with part 1 of at least 3. Take it away, me. Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. It's your old pal Black Swan here. And this is the next in our series of videos about William Lane Craig's debates. And in this one, I am so excited to be doing this. I've wanted to do it for a while. We're going to dive into the Kalam. Now, the video clips we're going to be referencing for the most part in this video are his debate with Sean Carroll. Because I feel like this is the quintessential Kalam debate that Craig has done, primarily because he leans a lot on cosmology and physics to support the premises of his argument. And Carroll is a physicist, and this is his field of expertise. So I think this is really a great one to be using. And I have a special guest with me today. Why don't you introduce yourself?
So I'm Vinny. Happen to be a Vinny that shares the last name as Dan here, actually. There's a funny story about that one. But as far as like what I'm bringing here, so something that you'll probably see as I begin to talk is I've actually done a lot of policy debate, and that's kind of why I want to be here, is because I'm looking to give a lot of like analysis onto like the ebb and flow in debate and like how we can judge things, the logic that people use. That's like, I'm really good with that technical stuff. I've been debating for 6 years, like actively involved in the community. I'm a computer science by trade, so like I'm no expert, but certainly I think I have some things to contribute.
All right, that's awesome. Couple of quick notes before we get rolling here. First of all, a reminder that nothing that we're bringing in this debate is intended to cast aspersions on either interlocutor. We're discussing style and technique, things like that. We're not going to motive. We're not going to call anybody like a disingenuous actor or anything like that.
Yeah, like I also want to like put out there, I've done my share of debating, and I've debated like for a lot of positions that I think are really horrible positions to hold as a human being, but like that's what you do in the debate. It's a sport.
Yeah.
So I don't judge people for anything they say in the rounds.
I brought you in because you are experienced in debate. The last time I did any formal debate, it was still Ronald Reagan's first term in office. But I do remember back then in high school, you would take the opposite position and just debate it as an exercise in debating, definitely. And again, we're going to critique Craig's style and his formulations because, again, I think this is fair game with Craig because he does bring this to the table where some people don't. I am going to include links in the video description to Sean Carroll and William Lane Craig's written thoughts on this debate. After they had the debate, Carroll wrote like a blog post. Craig answered a couple questions for people's on his website that was about the debate. So I'm going to include those links below. I definitely recommend going to read those. And I will have a link below to the video playlist that I'm using for this series. This video will be in that list. If I can remember, I'll put a card up here. Definitely take the time to watch this debate. This is one of the more enjoyable ones. I really enjoyed this debate with them. Another quick, I'm glancing down because I have notes here because we are going to be talking about a lot of stuff today. One of the terms I wanted to define that you hear Craig use is cosmogony. That's not a super common word. It really is just the study of the origins of the universe, and that's it. So when he brings that up, that's what he's talking about. Another thing I wanted to mention, we are going to avoid critiquing the Kalam on science issues for the most part, partly because Carroll is a physicist and he addresses the issues really well, better than either of us possibly could. Oh, yeah. Neither one of us is a physicist or a scientist. We're not qualified to comment on those kinds of things. And one of the reasons this feels important to me is there is an informal fallacy that's loosely tossed around called the argument from quantum physics. You see this a lot with people like Deepak Chopra, who will look at these really bizarre things that we see in quantum physics, like the double slit experiment or spooky action at distance, as they call it. And they will take these weird phenomena and try and apply them to metaphysics in a very broad way. Quantum physics is possibly the most obscure and difficult branch of physics that we have today. If you listen to what quantum physicists say, and Feynman was noted for this, basically, if you think you understand quantum physics, you don't understand quantum physics. We can model it exceptionally well. It is the best mathematical modeling we know of, but we still don't know actually what's going on. And there are times where people, atheists, will attack the Kalam, especially the premise about things beginning without a cause, and they'll say, well, quantum particles seem to pop into existence without a cause, and I think that's a fallacy on that side as well. I don't think they're any more justified pointing to quantum physics than Deepak Chopra is. So that's why we're going to avoid that.
We'll actually see, like, if we look at some of the arguments where, like, the failure in their logic actually applies to several of the arguments in the debate. Where it's, you're like making assumptions about how things work based on intuition, but like intuition just doesn't work when you're talking about things like quantum physics. And there's also some times where it doesn't work when you're talking about things like the universe. So we'll get into that later.
Yeah, we will get into that later, but intuition is not always a great measure to use. Another point on this, when talking about critiquing the Kalam from the point of physics, Craig likes to point to the physics to support his premises, but it's notable that if you look at a meta-analysis of physicists, what they feel about whether or not quantum physics applies to metaphysical ideas, like the origins of like gods existing or things like that, and you'll find they don't. They don't say that, look, this quantum physics means that this medical physical thing like a god is real. We are not all experts in everything. We can't be. So when you're dealing with areas that are highly specialized and highly technical like this, you rely on experts to deal with that. There is a danger of running into a fallacy called the argument from authority. When you're using people who aren't really authorities on a subject to try and support, or when there are authorities that don't have work to back up the positions that they're holding. And when you look at a broad spectrum of people, you have to go with what the majority is saying in a technical field. That's what stops this from being a fallacy of an argument from authority. The fact that these are the professionals. The professional consensus is not necessarily an argument from authority or a fallacy of ad populum fallacy, the fallacy from popular belief, which is the other one in there. Oh, and the other point I wanted to raise with this, the area of cosmology that we're dealing with the Kalam argument is one where we just really don't know all the answers. And it's kind of my opinion that we don't even know enough to know all the questions to ask yet. And there's a great gotcha moment from Carroll during this debate, and I'll play the clip for it in here. Dr. Craig likes to reference the Bordet-Guth-Vilenkin theorem, stating that the universe must have a beginning. And Carroll came up, and he actually knows Guth from co-wrote the theorem, and he pops the video up, and I'll show the video here.
Now, you might think that, there's a theorem by Alan Guth and Arvind Bordet and Alex Vilenkin that says the universe had a beginning. I've explained to you why that's not true, but in case you don't trust me, I happen to have Alan Guth right here, one of the authors of the Bordet-Guth-Vilenkin theorem. Alan, what do you say? He says, I don't know whether the universe had a beginning. I suspect the universe didn't have a beginning. It's very likely eternal, but nobody knows. Now, how in the world can the author of the Bordet-Guth-Vilenkin theorem say the universe is probably eternal for the reasons I've already told you? The theorem is only about classical descriptions of the universe, not about the universe itself.
My point is, if the authors of the theorem don't agree that it means the universe had a beginning, then who is William Lane Craig to say that that's what it means, and who is us? So that's just one of the greatest moments in this debate, honestly.
Yeah, it caught me really off guard. That was like a classic. Like, you can kind of tell like Craig is like out of his element and relying on the opinions of experts, but he's also just like debating against an actual expert.
Right.
So,
yeah.
That moment was just.
It was beautiful. It was brilliant. And his response to that, Craig's response to that, was just goofy.
I was curious how you'd address a point that was brought up about Guth probably holding that the universe, in fact, was eternal.
I haven't spoken to him about it. I have spoken with Vilenkin. I think they would agree that the theorem, under this single condition that it states, shows that classical space-time did have to have a beginning. And Guth doesn't dispute that. He says that. Now, when he holds up a little sign saying, I think the universe is probably eternal, that's probably just reflecting a sort of personal preference or skepticism that maybe we'll find a quantum theory or something that will be a non-classical model that will restore the eternality of the universe. That could be his predisposition or his hope or hunch or something of that sort.
He's like, oh, that must be his own personal opinion or something, or he hopes that it's going to be that way. And it's like, wow. So one of the people who authored this paper, you're totally 100% going with what he says. But the other person who authored this paper, nah, he doesn't matter. It's pretty crazy. There is one more thing to talk about with the science, too, and that is the danger from a theological and metaphysical position of looking to scientific ideas to support your beliefs. Now, this famously came up with a fellow by the name of Georges Lemaitre, who is the man who developed the theory that we now call the Big Bang Theory, which points to the origin of the universe. He was a Catholic Jesuit priest. And after he came up with this, the Pope said, this is great. We can use this scientific theory to prove that gods exist. And Lemaitre was like, no, don't do that. It might be wrong. So anytime you look to science to build on metaphysical ideas like this, you run the danger of the science changing and your ideas being screwed.
Right, because like the scientific community has the benefit of being able to say like, oh crap, we figured out that what we were saying was wrong. Like, we had all the things to support it, but as it turns out, we missed something. But like, theists don't really get to do that because they kind of claim to already have all the answers.
Right.
So
yeah, and if
you're saying like God made this model, look, it makes sense.
And then if the model changes, whoopsie. I mean, we noticed this happen, several hundred years ago with the Earth-centered universe.
Yeah,
Whoops.
people got killed because they were like, oh, look, like the science doesn't make sense. Church that you're purporting helps you prove that that God exists, right? Like, it's also, when we get into framework, we'll talk a bit about it more, but that's actually the entire basis for what this debate is doing with Craig. Like, he says science supports my religious position, and that's just, we'll see why that's problematic.
Yep. That's an excellent segue, because before we dive into the argument proper, Vinny, you're going to take us away with some framework stuff.
Okay, so when I talk about framework, what I really mean, right, is like, I am a spectator to the debate going on, but I'm also the judge, right? Like, the spectators are there to, be able to come up with a conclusion, hopefully. And so what each of the debaters is doing is they're trying to come up with like some type of win condition. They set the goal of what I need to convince my audience of for me to win. And each of our debaters did something I think was pretty interesting, particularly with Craig. So it's kind of hard to talk about without actually getting into the Kalam cosmological argument. But Craig takes a position with this argument where he's saying, I'm not trying to prove the existence of God, because he admits, like, for him to do that would be an awfully difficult task with the physicist in the room he's debating against. So what instead he tries to argue, it says, I don't want to prove the existence of God. I just want to prove that the work that you do actually makes God more likely, and he sets that up as his win condition, is to prove to the audience that the science makes the existence of God only more likely, because that's like a really reasonable thing to do. He like targets an audience who like might have some type of existing bias, saying like, yes, I believe God exists. And this audience is going to be looking for evidence from Craig to say like, yes, I can continue to believe my idea. And so that's like his win condition. Where Carroll, on the other hand, actually takes another really interesting response to that framework, where he says, I don't even care about that talk altogether. The reason I'm here for the debate is not to prove to you that like whether or not God is likely to exist. I'm just trying to show you why I know he doesn't. And that's like a really interesting air of authority to bring to the debate, but it also allows him to kind of sideskirt some of the discussion that Craig, or to engage in the discussion that Craig is hoping to sideskirt, which we'll see when we look at his first premise of the argument, exactly why this framework like matters so much in the context of the specifics of these arguments and their logic. That was the gist I got on framework.
Okay. So before we actually get into the argument itself, I want to talk about what type of argument this is. And as a layperson, and this is the information I've always seen online, this is considered a deductive argument. So if each premise is true, then the conclusion must follow from the premises. And the archetypal version of this argument is every man is mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. That's the kind of structure that Craig is going for. But this seems a little bit different than that to you, Vinny.
Yeah, so in particular, the reason why this seems really different is because he kind of like hides premises within premises, particularly if you look at the first premise. He says, if the universe began to exist, then there's a transcendent cause which brought the universe into existence. And if you notice, that actually takes on that deductive framework that you just used, right? So like we have this whole argument where it's like a deductive piece, but within the deductive piece is another deduction that we need to analyze.
So there's like a deductive argument inside the premise of the deductive argument.
Right. And as it turns out, that Carroll takes advantage of this in the debate, but that first premise is like not sound. It's obvious that he intentionally does this reduction.
Okay, so we'll get on to a little bit more of that. Okay, so let's talk a little bit really quick for the people that don't know about soundness and validity when it comes to arguments. So what makes an argument sound in structure?
Well, that's complicated to give in general for all types of argument, but here we're only looking at deductive arguments, so it's really easy to give an example. Where generally speaking, the logic behind a deductive argument falls apart only when one of the premises is false. So generally, they're very easy arguments to follow. If this, then that, and so this is true.
Right.
And if either of those two things don't work, then the third one, you don't have a conclusion.
Right. So my understanding is validity goes to the structure of the argument, and soundness goes to basically you have to have a valid structure and true premises, and then you have a sound argument.
Right. And he's obviously using a valid structure. We are able to identify it as a deductive structure.
Right.
And then, you just have to get onto whether or not these premises are valid.
Right.
And,
whether or not the premises are true, right? And okay,
yeah,
so that was another one of my questions. As far as analyzing the truth of a premise, and I'm sure this is different for any argument, it's going to vary a lot depending on the kind of premises you're putting out. What's the standard of evidence? Is it do you have to demonstrate that the premises are false, or is the burden of proof on the premise to establish that it is true? And if it doesn't meet that burden, then we're justified in rejecting the argument.
Yeah. So if the burden of proof is usually on the constructor, but I guess that would actually be more of a cultural thing rather than a math thing, right? Like when I look at logic, I always just assume the premises, right? Like if I'm looking at the soundness of an argument, I just assume everything to be true and go, okay, if it's all true, then I should believe the conclusion.
Right.
And now I leave it up to the debater, up to Craig in this case, to confirm that.
To prove the truth of the premises, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, one of the things that's definitely I noticed, and I'll put a clip in here of Craig, I feel like during the course of this, he creates a false dichotomy between absolute certainty and more probable.
In saying that the cosmogonic evidence confirms 2, I am not saying that we are certain that 2 is true. Too many people mistakenly equate knowledge with certainty. When they say that we do not know that the universe began to exist, what they really mean is that we are not certain that the universe began to exist. But of course, certainty is not the relevant standard here. The question is whether 2 is more plausible in light of the evidence than it's contradictory.
And there's all kinds of shades of gray between being absolutely certain, or maximally certain is actually a phrase that I prefer, because I don't think we can be absolutely certain about anything in reality. But we can be maximally certain about things. And I think there's a lot of gray between maximal certainty and more probable than not. And he tries to create this false dichotomy, like those are the only two positions that you can have. And man, I think that really is just not sound logic, not sound reasoning.
Right. So here's a moment where it's actually kind of a good time to say exactly what you're feeling and why logically you feel that way.
Okay.
So what he's actually doing here is something that's called an if and only if statement, logically speaking, right? He says, if the universe began to exist, then there is a transcendent cause that brought the universe into existence. Where intuitively, it seems like most people think in the form of oh yeah, it goes one way, so it works out.
Right.
But if you want to prove that this exact thing is the cause, the only way you can do that is to prove that both of those things will always coexist together. And generally, the way people do that is called an if and only if. So an if and only if statement's burden is to prove it in both directions. So not only does Craig have to prove that if the universe began to exist, then there was a transcendent creator, then he also has to prove if there was some transcendent creation event, then the universe exists. And you can see why that's not really something human beings can do.
No.
And that's why this premise doesn't work.
Because that's a concept that I had never heard before, is having to prove it, having for it to be sound in both directions that way.
Right. And that's how you actually create a false dichotomy. That's literally the definition. It's an if and only if statement that doesn't work in both directions.
It doesn't work in both directions.
You assume the conclusion by ignoring one piece of the logic.
Interesting. That's really cool. So I want to talk a little bit about Craig's preamble before he actually delivers the argument. And the first point I wanted to talk about was where he says he takes it as obvious that there's not even an apparent conflict between theism and modern cosmogonic theories. And I'll put that clip up here.
I take it as obvious that there does not exist even apparent conflict between contemporary cosmogonic theories and theism.
He does this throughout this debate. He just says, I take this as obvious, this is apparent, and he just throws these platitudes out. Is there a better word for it than that? He just like says, oh, it's clear. And I think he's trying, see, this is what feels like a tactic to me. He's trying to convince his audience that what he's saying is correct by his delivery, by the confidence of his delivery.
Yeah, not only the confidence of this delivery, but he does this a lot. He plays on classic human intuitions where, like, a lot of people, you know, most people have a belief in some type of theism in the area that his audience is in, I'm sure. And, like, people want to believe that. And so if they hear someone saying, like, yes, you can still believe my position while believing my opponent's, that gives him some credibility, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
He's like trying to associate as a member of his audience. He's like, again, doing that like very subtle othering that he does to his opponents a lot.
Yes, because when he comes out and says, I take it as obvious that this is true, if you don't take it as obvious that it's true, then suddenly you're being othered, like we've mentioned in the other debate, like I mentioned in my other video that you had brought up to me. The other one, I don't know if you had any thoughts on this, is in his preamble, he tries to head off what's known as the God of the Gaps argument. He's trying to distance himself from that. And that basically, that's shorthand for saying we have a gap in our scientific understanding, therefore God done it. And I mean, the classic example of this is why Thor was throwing lightning bolts and, you know, why volcanoes were gods and all that. People didn't understand these things. And we have a great tendency to anthropomorphize and to find agency in things, even if agency isn't necessarily there. I mean, I've heard this tossed around. Intuitively, it seems right to me, but if you think about early humans or even proto-humans, out on the African plain, you see the grass moving, that could be the breeze or it could be a predator. If you assume that there's a predator there and you run away, then you live and everything's fine. If you assume it's the wind and it turns out to be a predator, you lunch. So it makes sense that we would have this tendency to see agency in things where it isn't there because it used to be a survival instinct.
Yeah, like in general, inductive reasoning has just been very useful for humans throughout the entirety of their existence. And yeah, he like wants to claim that he's not doing any inductive reasoning, that he's, you know, using a deductive proof. But as it turns out, you know, we kind of already discussed this in that like first piece of his argument, he kind of uses some inductive reasoning there. So yeah. Craig tries to preface saying like, hey, I'm not doing any inductive reasoning. This isn't a God of the Gaps. And he's kind of right, because in the part of the argument he talks about his second premise, he actually doesn't really use any gods of the gaps logic.
Right.
But to get to that second premise, he has to use gods of the gaps logic.